Hello, welcome back to my channel. And yes, I am finally back after a 2-month hiatus. Didn't mean to go off that long, but things happen. And today I am going to be doing the first half of a very belated May wrap up. I read a total of 11 books in May, but then I only read about 5 or 6 in June. I feel like right now my makeup looks very 2016-esque, but we're gonna roll with it. I will be going over today the first five or six books I read in the month of May. I read a decent amount of translations back in 2 months ago: Arabic, Korean, Romanian, and Croatian. I don't think I'll get to the Croatian one today. If you are interested in my reviews, stick around and we will get started. The first book I finished in the month of May was Men in the Sun and Other Palestinian Stories by Ghassan Kanafani, translated from Arabic by Hilary Kilpatrick. So Ghassan Kanafani published works starting in the late 50s and the 60s. He was a Palestinian author and also activist, and he was assassinated in 1972 in Beirut. And so his works are pretty well known if you know anything about Palestinian literature or the Palestinian struggle. And so this is a very, very slim collection of, it has the title story, which is a novella, and then it has other short stories and an excerpt of a novel that he wrote. I think that for an Arabic translation, this was actually really well done. It kept the emotion, which I think is very difficult in times when you're reading a translation where the language is so different. It is beautiful, poetic, haunting, gut-punching. His writing, at least what he was evoking, does remind me of Adania Shibley's work. I think, though, that his writing was a little more flowery, perhaps, a little more descriptive, whereas hers is more stark. I thought that the two stories that really stood out to me were the title novella, which follows, I think, 4 men who are trying to travel from Palestine in the 1960s to Jordan to get work. And they end up getting transported in, I'm blanking out, but it's like a certain type of like a lorry, and all the mayhem that ensues with that. And then the other short story that really stuck out to me was Letter from Gaza, which is the oldest in this collection. It was published in 1956. Some lines I wanted to read from Letter from Gaza. This Gaza on which we had lived, and with those good people we had spent 7 years of defeat, was something new. It seemed to me just a beginning. Everything in this Gaza throbbed with sadness, which was not confined to weeping. It was a challenge, more than that. It was something like reclamation of the amputated leg. And then the other quote that I wrote down, which I don't remember what story this was from, was, I was sure that the God we had known in Palestine had left it too, and was a refugee in some place that I did not know, unable to find a solution to his own problems. So I definitely recommend checking this out. It is a very short read, and I rated it 4 stars. The next book I read was called Ponti by Sharlene Teo. This takes place in Thailand, even though it was published originally in English, and it is for those people that like old horror B films from the 60s and 70s, as well as mother-daughter stories. It follows 3 different people. So it follows this actress, former B-list actress named Amisa, who starred in a trilogy of horror movies called Ponti in the 60s and 70s, or 70s and 80s, I believe. And then she becomes like this medium and is like working out of her house with her sister. And then we also follow her daughter Suzu in the early 2000s as a teen, and her rather tumultuous, complicated relationship with her mother. And then we also follow, the third person is Circe, a friend of Suzu's in the year 2020. And Circe is actually working as a marketing assistant associate at a company that is a film company that is rebooting Ponti and has recast another actress. And because she had this very complex friendship with the daughter, Suzu, it stirs up some memories and feelings. Now, I liked the atmospheric vibe. I liked the different elements that made up the plot. But to be honest with you, I don't remember this too well. There is like a reveal towards the end of the book as to why Suzu and Circe were friends and then they had a falling out. And I kind of felt like it was a bit of a nothing burger. I thought there would be something more serious than there was. So I liked this, honestly. It's just not really a book that stuck with me. I rated it 4 stars. It might be more like 3.75, but yeah, it's fine. I think it would be a cool film. It just didn't really stick with me for some reason. And the next book I read was called The Accusation, Forbidden Stories from Inside North Korea by Bandi, which is a pseudonym, translated from Korean by Deborah Smith. This was allegedly smuggled out of North Korea sometime in the I think maybe late 2000s, early 2010s. And the collection of short stories is supposed to be this like secret expose into the everyday lives of North Koreans. Most of the stories, because they're dated, are dated 1993, which was an excessive period of hardship in North Korea because that was shortly after the Soviet Union collapsed. It was one of their few trading partners, so there was a lot of stuff going on. This book, I do not know how much of it is real and how much of it is, even the backstory is maybe exaggerated. There's very like common themes in this. It's very, very didactic, right? The common themes are everyone is suspicious and quick to report each other and betray each other for every kind of minor offense. Hard work doesn't pay off. Your parents or your grandparents' behavior has an influence on your social standing in society, etc., etc. And a lot of times the realization at the end of these stories are the main characters realize that the lives they are living as they are trying to survive are a complete lie if they have been loyal to the government, or they commit some minor infraction and they're like deported to the countryside. So I honestly, the other North Korean novel that I have read was Friend, which I reviewed, I think in my April wrap up. And I honestly liked that one better because this book, I mean, besides being so didactic, it's beyond just like criticizing the Kim regime. It goes into like straight up anti-communist propaganda, and I literally felt like I was reading like counter-propaganda from the CIA during the Cold War. There was also a lot of stuff that was like very anti-Karl Marx and attributions to him that he literally never said. Like, he never said communism is a world of light and capitalism is a world of darkness. Like, no. Like, I literally, I don't know. It was just so over the top. And I just don't like didactic writing that is beating you over the head and is spoon feeding you stuff. And because I live in America, which is already very, very anti-communist, anti-socialist to begin with, I don't need to like go out seeking that propaganda because it's like the air we breathe. So I rated it 3 stars. I think that there was like some dark humor in this. The one story is called Pandemonium, where this old woman ends up meeting Kim Il-sung, and that was actually kind of funny in a way. What else I wrote down? Record of a Defection and the Red Mushroom, because they did interweave like a nice narrative, right? But I don't know. I would recommend Friend over this. So yeah, 3 stars. The next book I read was Cooling the Tropics, Ice, Indigeneity, and Hawaiian Refreshment by, I'm not going to attempt to say her name, Hilary Julia, Hawaiian surname, Hobart. You will never look at ice and iced food the same way again after reading this book. This is a really interesting, fascinating case study into the colonization of Hawaii. via food and thermal temperatures. And it's divided up into several sections. So the first section is actually about the ongoing land rights struggle against the building of the TMT, the 30-mile telescope, onto Mauna Kea, which is a volcano in one of the Hawaiian Islands that holds sacred religious beliefs to Native Hawaiians. And because it is not being used, it is seen as a terra nullius. And so the struggles and the language and the events that are around this ongoing resistance by Indigenous Hawaiians actually mirrors a lot of the land rights struggles that are still playing out here in the U.S. against Native Americans. I was especially intrigued by this book when the author mentions that our emotional associations with different temperature levels is not universal. And so the belief that ice or something cool can be refreshing and relaxing was not something that was shared across the board by people who lived in hot climates. And I honestly wish that she had gone into this a little bit more. We get into like the ice trade and refrigeration techniques and how food and cuisine is so highly political, how Native Hawaiians' food was banned, and how iced desserts were brought to Hawaii, how Native Hawaiians didn't really incorporate ice into their diets, even though they were well aware of snow and ice that existed on the peaks of volcanoes, but it was not really something that came about until Europeans brought it. And of course, Europeans believed that they were bringing civilization to the natives. So overall, I really recommend this. It is a university press title. It is a really fascinating history about things that you probably never thought of as being political, such as iced and iced refreshments, and how these things can be tied into notions of racial superiority and cultural erasure and colonization. I also think it is a really necessary crash course into the history of Hawaii, its annexation as a territory, its statehood, and its present image on the world stage as in service to U.S. empire, militarily, scientifically, and as a tourist haven. So I rated this 4 stars. The next book I read was another translation, and it was called I'm an Old Commie by Dan Lungu, translated from Romanian by Alistair Ian Blyth. Love the title. It's becoming me as I age. This is about generational divides among parents and their children, and how our material conditions and circumstances can completely mold and shape our political views and our understandings of the world. So this follows a pensioner in northern Romania named Emilia, and it goes through, has like 3 different timelines. The present is in the year 2000, and it is during the dawn of like the neoliberal era in Romania, and Emilia honestly associates her youth with being under communism, under the Ceausescu regime. And in her mind, she just feels that the current political climate, everything is so expensive, she can't really afford anything. When she was living under the communists, she had a well-paying factory job, she was able to live. You know, everything was just so much better back then. And they are not going to have free elections. And her daughter, who lives in Canada, calls her up and says, do not vote for the Communist Party. And Amelia's like, why not? Things were so much better then. And so we get into different phases of her life. It alternates each chapter. We follow her as like a young girl from a very poor rural family, and then she goes and she leaves her family to go find work in the city in a factory, and then we follow her years. It's like probably in her like 20s or 30s when she is a factory worker there, and what that was like politically, how things were organized, how the workplace was structured. And I overall actually really enjoyed this. I think it touches on not just the generational divide and how, like I said, our material conditions can really impact us generation to generation, but also how the false hope of revolution can sometimes lead to outcomes that are not always better, and how many of us often look back on our youth and things at that time through rose-colored glasses without really taking into account the bad things and not really processing them or forgetting about them. There were a couple lines that I did really like in this book. One was, Amelia says to her daughter, "You know what? It's the people who got rich overnight, who travel, the people who stole everything we worked for. As for shouting, you can shout as much as you like, because nobody's listening anyway. If it were up to me, I'd bring communism back tomorrow. You can shout, but no one's listening." Yeah, that sounds like living in a liberal democracy. So yes, I really liked this. It's a very short read, and I rated it 4 stars. And then the last book I will be reviewing for this specific video is called Queer Palestine in the Empire of Critique by Syed Atshan. I wanted to actually read and review this for June, for Pride Month, but I ended up getting it early in an interlibrary loan. So I rated this 3.5 stars. It is another academic press title. I think overall the book was really well written and was very fascinating, but I do think at times the author's conclusions either seemed a bit contradictory or just haven't aged well in light of the past 3 years. So this book details at length the ways in which queer Palestinians' existence is highly politicized and scrutinized from every angle. Syed Atshan has faced numerous obstacles in his life, from spending significant time growing up in Palestine, although I believe he is an American citizen and he was born here, to coming out as a gay man and devoting much of his life to LGBTQ activism. The central tenet of this book asks the following: when does critique result in clarity and cohesion in socio-political movements, and when does it have the unintended consequence of paralysis and discouragement? How do we navigate the messy terrains of intersectionality, the sometimes messy terrains? So a lot of this book delves into pinkwashing, how Israel has prided itself on its gay friendliness to shield its gross human rights critiques, human rights abuses of Palestinians, and also to contrast its image as this beacon of liberal democracy and enlightenment against the barbarous, savage hordes of the Middle East. And this concept is really not new to Zionism. Many early Christian and Jewish Zionists alike saw the creation of Israel as this colonial outpost in the Middle East that would bring European enlightenment to the region. Syed Atshan goes into how homophobia within Palestinian society is further inflamed not only by Israel's promotion of this dichotomy, but also by its blackmailing of LGBT Palestinians to use as informants, further solidifying this false dichotomy that queerness is not only a Western intervention that is used to justify imperialism, but that queer Palestinians are inherently tied to Israel's very project and therefore are untrustworthy. There's an entire section about how Atshan goes into detail about how Israel is not as LGBT friendly as it portrays itself, which is mainly tied to Orthodox Judaism. And I would also argue like the militaristic mindset of Zionism also adds to this. And going back to the religious concept of Orthodox Judaism and homophobia, that is also linked to Muslim and Christian communities within Palestine. And I think that what he leaves out is why religiosity is so deeply embedded within Palestinian society. And I suspect it has to do with that when you are under constant suffocation and bombardment, people need to grasp for something larger outside of themselves. And that is why people often turn to faith. I felt that he could have, honestly, there was further elaborations and my own knowledge of the region that he could have gone into why secular leftist organizations like the PFLP to Fatah, were either violently crushed or ended up as collaborators, and how that then gave space as the only form of resistance being more conservative religious movements. And that is why today in the Middle East, anti-imperialism is largely taken up not by socialists or communists, but by Islamist movements. And this is like not just Palestine, it's throughout the entire region. How does that link back to homophobia? I think he could have gone a little more into that, and he did not, but maybe that would have been a bit off topic. I think what my biggest issue with this book was the sort of liberal both sidesism that was kind of at play. He kind of talks out both sides of his mouth because he claims to support BDS, but then also says he supports further collaboration between queer Palestinians and queer Israelis because they are victims of the same state, which I think is a false equivalence, and I don't really think I have to go into detail why I think that if you are fine seeing someone as an ally when they have a complicated view of something that is not complicated is a major red flag. So there was just parts of this book to me that just did not really age well. I think the author means well. I think that his activism is commendable, but I do think that this does breed a bit too much into liberalism, and he did mention a specific academic that he criticized a specific academic that I actually want to read, so I will be getting to that man's work later on at some point. But I would rate this book 3.5 stars. I think it was well written, it was fascinating, and I think there was other things he could have delved into a bit deeper, but I just didn't quite align fully with his politics. So yeah, and that's it. And those are, I think I did 6 books for May, so stay tuned for the rest of the May wrap up and the June, and also my mid-year freakout tag. I'm going to start batching these. So yeah, let me know if you've read any of these books or if you want to, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.